All right, welcome everyone to our third session. Kaya Mendel is going to be our moderator, facilitator, discussion leader. And so the floor, as they say, my friend, is yours.
Okay. Yeah. How is everyone doing?
Good.
Yeah. So how I usually like to read in a group is to read, let the author speak for themselves. And I certainly have an interest to hear from you. We'll see what happens. I think we're starting from page 83. Is that right, Daniel?
Yeah, depending on what version you have. Let's see here. I think we did, yeah, I think around chapter 3, towards the late part of chapter 3. So maybe kind of summarizing chapter 3 might be a good way to begin, if you'd like. I don't know, or giving us your impression of it.
I prefer not to. Let's see. Who would like to start
on a summary?
How is your understanding of
Sure.
of the rest of the chapter?
Sure.
I'm particularly moved by the notion of the double.
Yeah.
And it's been maybe taken up before Girard by pacifism. And it's a very strange idea. If you're looking at things functionally, that there's no distinction ethically between two sides in a contest.
Yes, that is a striking kind of theme or motif that Girard develops. I also, for me, I felt like the argument, let's say the wider argument that he's presenting around myth is that myth, or rather, he sort of makes Oedipus into two dynamics. There is the Oedipus myth, which is this kind of story or saga of impersonalized violence, right? What does it mean, impersonalized? He talks about the anger of Oedipus a lot in the beginning. And by anger, what he says about anger is very interesting, which is that the anger was bound up with the other, namely his father, and vice versa. So because they could not locate, quote unquote, the source, or rather maybe you could say they could not identify the autonomy of their own anger, it was depersonalized. And that is one way to signify what a tragedy is, which is impersonal violence. And so it's violence where causality is out the window, right? So in some sense, you think of the actors as automatons, right? Or sort of, and then it's precisely there at that status where the resemblance comes into play and where the conflict becomes familial. And so the reason that is the case is because the sacrificial mechanism has broken down in the society, right? So we remember that quite well, right? And we also remember that different societies have different ways of enacting the sacrificial mechanism, and is usually through a rite. So a rite is a repetition of an original sacrifice that is not obviously displaying the horror of the original act, but kind of imitating it to satiate that thing. Yeah? So tragedy, therefore, is the display of a world in which rites and sacrificial mechanisms are broken down. Okay. So that's my basic understanding of it. And then he just simply analyzes the play kind of very closely and elucidates a really strong argument from those premises, right? And I think one of the things that you're left with is the meaning of surrogate victim. So what does Oedipus do to the status of surrogate victim? And how is that also related to other iconic surrogate victims like Jesus Christ or Dionysus, and so on and so forth? So Oedipus has something unique to teach the Western culture about the nature of a surrogate victim. So maybe one thing to do to begin with would be to actually locate a passage, right, from that chapter, just so we're clear on what Oedipus, so to speak's contribution is in this regard. I don't know if that would be helpful, or if anybody has any other further things to say in terms of summarizing it.
I had I put a comment in the Slack about how the solution appears clearly. I mean, this has been bothering me under the surface for weeks, but I finally put it into words. That this is brilliantly explicating the process, the skeletal structure of violence, but the solution seems to be, I don't know if there's any ever any addition, simply to resist, right, to cut it out. And isn't the point though that I mean, the greatest gift that we get from the Bible, according to Girard, is this idea of moving the sacrifice from the child to the animal. And then the Christians kind of went back a step in a way. I don't know what happened there, but I mean, that's not much, right? I mean, it's still we're still talking about not sacrificing your child.
Right.
And he also talks about Nietzsche, how Nietzsche would often sign in his days before the madness Dionysus. And Girard talks about the difference between Dionysus and Oedipus.
Right.
But yeah, let's first see. Does anyone have a portion from the text on the Oedipus that was maybe difficult, that stood out, that was helpful?
Well, one thing he says is that it starts off with a plague. We often forget. Basically, it starts off with two guys whose social roles are not defined, are not fixed in the context of a social strife. And it suddenly becomes clear that the society is melting down because it lacks, I guess you could say, the proper surrogate victim, I think is what he's trying to say. So if you see on page 87 in mine, he says, the plague motif is only one of many that could serve equally well to conceal the presence of the sacrificial crisis and its violent outcome. For example, there are stories of collective salvation in which the death of a single victim serves to appease the anger of some god or spirit. A lone individual who may or may not have been guilty of some past crime is offered up to a ferocious monster. The function of the surrogate victim explains the principal motifs of the Oedipus myth and illuminates the genesis and structure of these motifs. Moreover, I believe that this same process serves to explain a great many other myths. So, what is the sacrificial event in Oedipus? Is it not the killing of the father, right? So I guess my question is it doesn't seem to me, it seems like a negative example of his idea that he presented earlier, which is that, look, in chapter 1, he lays everything out, says, look, we need sort of systems of transcendence that can confer legitimacy through knowing how to identify sacrificial events and moments and rites, and that leads to distinctions in a world of stability and harmony, and that's important. But then he says tragedy is the inverse of that. But then there is a surrogate victim within the tragic story, right? So then the surrogate event must be what?
Well, somebody asked him this question. A woman who wrote an important book on Oedipus, I forget now. Oedipus is innocent. Right, that he didn't do anything wrong, so to speak. And he said he answered that that's precisely why this is a good example, because the guilt is omitted from the story.
Interesting. Interesting.
Well, I think too, you could look at the idea of the curtain, or the revealing and concealing aspects. It seems like there's something hidden from view here with Oedipus. He sort of does seem to do all the right things, but I think Girard is sort of pointing to he doesn't have a role and he gets angry. So like there's something there that doesn't quite fit with the savior idea.
Absolutely.
And there's a hidden violence there too. Like he gets angry beforehand, and like that's a problem, but yet it sort of doesn't affect anybody.
Right.
And then I think too, at the end, Oedipus sort of changes into this person who says, yeah, I am guilty, but I'm guilty from sort of a societal level, not that individual level. And he sort of accepts that and says, I accept my fate, even though he might be innocent, so to speak. So then there's this kind of reversal there.
What do you mean? So he's guilty at a societal level. What do you mean by that?
Well, because everybody's guilty on some level. And here, what we tend to do is say that the person is guilty. But I think this is what's questioning that. Is he really guilty? Well, it sounds like he's kind of not. But he's able to sort of accept it and say, I will bear the responsibility of society as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like if the role of the family is discombobulated, despite the lack of, what Girard would call a world of distinctions, despite the existence of that, what you're saying, Ben, is that there's still is a sort of force that could confer guilt. So then what is the nature of that destiny or fate?
Yes, right. Yes.
It's a different kind of fate.
It is. Right. It's like the tragedy. It's something sort of beyond violence. And even if we can sort of meet it out and say, well, it's both sides being equal, at the end of the day, one side has to win and one side loses, or fate sort of wins. So it's still unfair, sort of, and it's tragically unfair. So even if things are sort of equal, they're not equal. So I think that's even where sort of the double idea comes in some ways, because you have things that appear totally the same, but that's not really how they are. There's something underneath that's different. And that's all it takes to sort of break.
Yeah.
And for me too, sort of what I try to think about here, I think is more of a Lacanian idea about the symbol itself.
Right.
But like when we create a symbol sort of in an individual level, the symbol sort of exceeds what we create of the symbol. So there's an excess.
Yeah.
And then when we create a symbol, it's sort of violent. It's sort of like over time, we have to sort of make it so and repeat it. Yeah. So we're taking all this information and making it into one thing out of all the possibilities. So doing that is kind of violent.
Right.
So looking at it from that perspective, then you can say, well, that fits with sort of, I think you could say that fits with the initial Oedipus who's angry. From an individual level, he doesn't have a place, he's angry, And so there's not really a repercussion because at that level, the symbol sort of isn't formed. It's sort of anything goes. But later you have this whole society, and when it gets violent, it has a repercussion. And it's sort of a faded repercussion. So it has the heightened aspect there.
I think one way to understand the, let's say, literary significance of Oedipus from a mythical, literary, but also religious standpoint is to compare what he does on page 86, the logic of surrogate victim in Oedipus compared to religion, where he says that the surrogate victim in a religious scenario submits to violence, quote, without provoking a reprisal.
Exactly.
A supernatural being who sows violence to reap peace. So
yes,
you think of God's commandment to Abraham as a perfect example of this. And it's the Abraham example is a good one because it's like 3 levels. Like we today in the Abrahamic religions will reenact the willingness of Abraham's sacrifice. Like we're basically reenacting his willpower because there was no event. There was nothing happened, you know?
Right.
So I love that. It's so weird. It's such a weird, like philosophical, Kierkegaard loved this whole thing so much, right?
Yeah.
So, but he says, okay. Now, Oedipus is initially an evil force and subsequently a beneficial one. It's not a question of exonerating him because the question of blaming him in the modern moralistic sense of the term never arises. Nor for that matter does religious empiricism show any interest in initiating one of those programs of rehabilitation so fashionable today among thinkers who claim to have freed themselves from the shackles of morality. The claims of religious thought are too modest, too tempered by fear for its opponents to assume such lofty attitudes. So the mysterious union of the most evil and the most beneficial forces is of vital concern to the community and can neither be challenged nor ignored. Nevertheless, it's a paradox that totally escapes human comprehension, and religion humbly acknowledges its impotence. So we're building up to the point. It is beneficial, the beneficial Oedipus at Colonus supersedes the earlier evil Oedipus, but he does not negate him. How could he negate him? Since it was the expulsion of a guilty Oedipus that prompted the departure of violence. The peaceful outcome of his expulsion confirms the justice of the sentence passed on him, his unanimous conviction for patricide and incest. If Oedipus is indeed the savior of the community, it is because he is a patricidal and incestuous son. So what does that mean?
Well, I think
the supernatural force, what the hell is this? Why then would he be a hero for following through with the...
Well, I think here what we're looking at from sort of a top-down perspective or a sociological perspective is the difference of what we can see between violence and peace. So here from sort of a bird's eye view, we can see where Oedipus does what he does and then there's peace. So we have to say, oh, wow, it must have been Oedipus that had something to do with this. And if he was sacrificial to his fate, that brought about this. And it's sort of like the same idea that people of primitive people might say as well. We have this violence, we need to do something about it. Let's get out in front of it. And we'll be proactive about it. And that will help everything even out. And it will slow down violence. And maybe there's a truth to that. So that was kind of how I see that, I guess, that it's sort of sandwiched paradoxically in between peace is this sort of violent thing that has no repercussion.
Has what? Has no repercussion?
No repercussion because Oedipus submits to it. And he says, where did you see that? You said earlier that he accepted it upon himself. I mean, he fought tooth and nail. He was cursing the gods. Well, maybe it was an earlier chapter, but it seemed to me that he, and at the end of the day, Girard paints it that he sort of accepts his fate. Maybe I.
Isn't that the point of Oedipus at Colonus, why he is redeemed from his evilness?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah.
I think that's what that means. Yeah.
Well, it's
But
also. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Levi.
Well, what I was thinking to Daniel's question, basically, it's actually that, like, the saving grace of Oedipus is that he committed the crime. It's actually that the criminal commits the crime that saves the community in some sense, is the way I interpret it. Because if you always have the thing that's haunting the community is the father and the mother, right? Patricide and incest in some sense. So if you can actually have someone who has committed, confessed to, and then been found unanimously guilty of the crime, you get to place the thing that haunts the community into a person. Yes. In a way that can no longer be memetic. So we can say it's just Oedipus now, that's right. Him, right. And it's not us. And therefore you can banish it outside the community, and the community constitutes itself again, because the violence is in Oedipus fully, I think is what Girard is saying.
That's excellent. That's exactly, that would mean then that the brothers that killed the father in Totem and Taboo become the redeemed heroes in some sense. But that is also why for Freud, every social order has to deal with and here you could almost read Freud as vis-a-vis the logic of surrogate, because the father haunts the social order as a symbolic presence, right? No longer as a real presence, right? In the same way that God's mercy is extended by virtue of Abraham's obedience. And it's not just to him. If you reenact this, you too will receive the same mercy, right? So I see what you're saying vis-a-vis Oedipus. That then means that Oedipus is no longer dealing with a supernatural entity, but it's an imminent law of the community, like a secular myth. Right?
I see something something essential is being left unsaid.
Okay.
Right. In the portion you read earlier on page 81, he says that once with the community by being brought together and uniformly applied to all the members, the shape and substance of the crisis becomes clear. And here, with what Ben was saying, I'm hearing that very one who decides to take up, maybe not as a criminal, but to take up an action, to choose, is also perpetuating the violence and nourishing the cycle. And that is because it's never going to be taken upon just one person. That's what he's saying. It's as you said, Daniel, it's imminent. So how does it work? Can we be atoned for by one man, or is violence at the core of the structure of being?
Well, I think that's what Girard is trying to specifically get at with this idea of the surrogate victim, right? Is the thing that violence is always haunting the community because of memetic desire, because multiple people desire what Girard said is the same thing. And so when that happens, it means that violence is always there within the community, threatening to end it or dissolve it in some way. And it's only through, as Girard says, a surrogate victim or a scapegoat that the society can hide this violence from itself, right? This is a thing that's hidden. It's you get to say that it's this victim, it is this, and it is always a criminal, I think, right? Because you have to criminalize it and put it into the victim.
But I think if you'll remember, I think the missing component here is the aphorism of Heraclitus at the very conclusion of the chapter, which says, quote, "Strife is the father and king of all, some it makes gods, others men, some slaves, and others free. So remember what I said before about stasis, and how, in my opinion, everything in Girard, or much, hinges on the importance of maintaining a social stability, or in this case, keeping strife at bay. Huh? Is it not the case then that Oedipus is a secular myth about a warning of, or rather a kind of demonstration of the sacrifice needed to maintain a world without strife, or a world where strife is at bay? And he then is the hero of precisely a kind of social harmony, right? Is that fair? I mean, what do you think? Is that a decent? What do you think?
Levi, my my internet is really bad today, so the sound is kind of off. But from what I heard, maybe you could repeat. I mean, I'm thinking of the law of the heart in Hegel's phenomenology, and so that I'm left, you know, as I wrote. I mean, the question, these ideas are more and more are becoming rich for me, and blossoming everywhere. But
Yeah.
unlike
I'm
with
with you on
Freud,
that.
but I don't know how I could think with Girard.
Yeah. I'm in the same place. I wonder, I wrote something down between last week and this week to try to help clarify some of that. So I wonder if I could share that and you guys see what you think of it. My first question is what Girard's saying is what he is saying accurate? And I think so. My second question is what he is arguing possibly helpful to contain and or explain violence in general? And I think again, the answer is yes. And the reason I say that is because it appears what the religious and ritualized sacred practices are doing is proactively choosing otherwise. Instead of being violent, they're attempting to find the right balance of violence by encouraging everyone to act in that same way, mimesis, symbolically toward a different reality. One could argue that these practices are not sufficient, that violence continues to overcome and overwhelm people and societies, and there is no justification in having had these practices. I would disagree. The reason is because one person in any society cannot entirely alleviate violence. Violence is inherent in the act of living and dying, propagating, and it's inside of language and the symbolization process. Like Lacan says about the truth, we can only half know it. In this case, we can only half solve violence. For society and the individual, due to the position one is in, violence is not able to be eradicated completely. What one can do is choose entirely otherwise. Whether it's the establishment of institutions, religion, for others to join, where nonviolence becomes part of the cultural practice, or whether one chooses compassion, or one even chooses neutrality versus revenge. In all these cases, one is creating a world for others to follow that can be replicated and advanced. It is a means not to establish a perfect harmony, but to view it in the context of our violent natures accurately. And having chosen that path, violence becomes justifiably, and if but for a time, displaced, vanquished, and omitted.
Right.
So we're providing a framework
A
for
framework,
which
yes.
the future can better hold it.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think maybe what Daniel was saying is that this is in some sense like by creating a secular myth, right? This is maybe kind of what you're saying in some sense, is that Girard is trying to take Oedipus and he's saying, what are the two things that Freud has identified as plaguing actual society, right? Which is patricide and incest. And so we're not talking about religious myth in the same way anymore. We're talking about the secularization, which is embodied in Oedipus rather than, say, in the figure of Christ, because Oedipus is directly in like dealing with these two things in some sense, right? So Girard is trying to then think about a secular way forward with violence. But my question still is the idea that desire is memetic. I still am not entirely convinced if that is the case. And
do
I
you-
guess, sorry, Daniel.
What do you mean? You're not convinced? What do you mean?
Well, I'm not convinced that the idea that, here's what I mean. I think that like I've written it down too, so I just want to look at my notes quick. Memetic desire, I guess, supposes that ultimately, I mean, within a society that obviously there is this thing that multiple people want simultaneously. Within, I guess it's the mother and the father to have sex with the mother and to kill the father, I guess, is what Girard is trying to say. These are the driving mimetic desires of a society. But that's what I'm unclear about.
That's a kind of a Freudian reading of Girard. I don't know if he ever does exactly that. It's just really that, you know, like two kids with one toy. They fight over the toy, though, even though there's a million toys.
That's right. In fact, Girard does not want to go down to a strict Freudian road with the sexual determinism. Right? He does not want to do that. So for him, the logic is based in a logic of if you want to talk about it psychoanalytically, it's the difference between actually privileging a completely different theory of desire and putting an identificatory imitation impulse for which there are multiplicity of impulses depending on the cultural or situational milieu of the individual. But irrespective of situation, it's this impulse of imitation that is primary to the human. And obviously, you know, when we get to the chapter 6, which we can talk about, I think, next week, that's where we get into the real meat, because it's the one on mimetic desire, you know, which he hasn't really introduced mimetic desire yet, right? Right now he's building the case for sacrifice, right? And he's building a kind of architecture of his argument, because he's trying to identify this overlapping logic across so many various examples, from ethnology to religion to mythology to drama, etc., etc., etc. So we're not quite there yet. Like, I feel like the verdict on mimetic desire we need to get to next week. Yeah.
Sure, fair enough.
Yeah, that's what I would say about that. But Kayam, do you have you put together thoughts on how to present chapter 4 on the origins of myth and ritual?
Are we?
Sorry, jump in.
Yeah, sorry. I had one more passage from chapter 3 that I thought was kind of maybe revealing with a certain interpretation of, if not exactly Girard's politics of his followers a little bit, and it has to deal with the consequences of incest and parricide from the Oedipus myth. Okay. That last paragraph on 74. If it's okay to read that.
Go for it.
When it has succeeded in abolishing even the traditional father-son relationship, violent reciprocity is left in sole command of the battlefield. Its victory could hardly be more complete, for in pitting father against son, it has chosen as the basis of their rivalry an object solemnly consecrated as belonging to the father and formally forbidden the son, that is, the father's wife and son's mother. Incest is also a form of violence, an extreme form, and plays in consequence an extreme role in the destruction of differences. It destroys that other crucial family distinction, that between the mother and her children, between patricide and incest, the violent abolition of all family differences is achieved. The process that links violence to the loss of distinction will naturally perceive incest and patricide as its ultimate goals. No possibility of difference then remains, no aspect of life is immune from the onslaught of violence. And what I take from that a little bit is that I could see like right-wing Girardians seeing at least like their view of the leftist position as being like an elimination of difference, only inevitably leading to generalized violent reciprocity. And even just thinking of the one book that got like maybe memed a little bit on Twitter, like Sophie Lewis's book, I think, which was called Full Surrogacy Now, And it was on the abolition of the family. There's a nice little sync up between that and Girard's.
Nice. Sorry, that's really funny. I never made that connection. I should have. I feel envious of you for making that connection. We need a Girardian reading of Sophie Lewis. Wow. Oh, by the way, Jonathan, hello and welcome.
You guys know each other?
Yes, we do. Yes, of course. Can you unmute? Do you know how to do that? Hi.
So, hi, Daniel. I met Daniel in EGS in 2012.
How are you?
I'm all right. Yeah, I'm actually in quarantine in China at the moment.
My.
I've just arrived back in the country, so I have to stay in this hotel room for 2 weeks.
Oh, okay. You didn't test positive though, no?
Well, I've been tested 3 times already, so no, I think I'm fine. And then I have to have another 2 weeks of self-isolation in my flat before I can go back to my university campus.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah, they're very strict in China about keeping the virus out now that they've repressed it, suppressed it.
Suppressed, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. It's nice to have you on board. Are you a reader of René Girard? Are you like familiar with?
I'd like to be. I haven't been. I wasn't given. I wasn't able to prepare that well for today, so I was being quiet. But yeah, Chaim told me about this group, and I would like to be properly prepared for next week.
Sure.
That's okay. Yeah.
No, it's good. It's nice to have you. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Daniel, what was the point that you had made before Cade started talking? I had an important question there.
Oh, the point I was making was around the centrality of strife, and the question of yeah, like Oedipus is a secular myth around the a lesson for humanity in the maintenance of a social order, right?
Oh,
sacrifice that's required for it, something like that.
yeah.
But then the question then does become an interesting one, and I think Levi raised it, which is, what then does Girard have to say about sexuality if patricide is the thing that is the problem? Why is it the problem? Why is it the problem? Is it the problem because it then becomes a circular argument? You see why? Because in a stable society, does that mean a society without strife, right? Does that mean that incest is no longer a problem? You see my point? For Freud, he can answer this, right? Because the problem of incest is more primary, having to do with his own theory of the Oedipus complex bound up within the drives and so on, right? So again, I think we need to, I guess, yeah, we're reading.
If we don't have that
Go ahead.
located within, is that what you're asking? If we don't have the drive, we don't have.
What do you think about this, about Girard and sexuality and incest and so on? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I was thinking what you had described. It sounds a lot like ego identification in the mirror stage, and there's a lot of physiological evidence being discovered now to prove conclusively Girard's theories. And there's something called the mirror neuron, and many more. So I'm wondering. I was wondering while you were talking, is if all of this is simply like the technique of what's going on in the imaginary.
Yeah, in the Lacanian sense of the imaginary.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I mean, the Lacanian sense of the imaginary is still structured on the Oedipal logic. You can't really break it from that. So,
in what sense?
In the sense that relation of a triangular relation of the child's desire and the development of the child's desire is still dependent, well, on logic of phallus, basically. I would say that the one of the primary operating concepts within mirror stage and of the imaginary is possession of phallus. And I think that for Girard, this is not a site of, that's not the site of the conflict, right? Possession of phallus is not the site of the conflict for him, as far as
Why not? We're
Well,
talking about the imaginary.
We need to get to his chapter on psychoanalysis. So we're trying to, we can't really, I know it's kind of frustrating to speak about Girard in sequence, because you sort of have these questions that he's going to discuss later. But he has a whole chapter on that, right? He even has one on incest prohibition and totem taboo as well. So, yeah, maybe we should just read the whole book and then have a general conversation. We could do that, I suppose. So anyways, yeah, but you're right. It's very close. I mean, it's very close to.
Right, the phallus is that which is not present. And here, what is it that we're talking about? Theft. We're talking about, you know, that which the other possesses, and I need to have it.
That's true, but the development of the ego of the mirror stage is not based on a mimesis logic. It's based on an imaginary projection of the self. And the relationship of the other is to desire. So Lacan will say that the desire is in the field of the other. The desire is not bound up within my own double. The desire is not within my ego. The desire is actually exterior, right? In the Lacanian imaginary. So I think the location of desire is very different for Lacan and Girard in this way.
It sounds like exactly the same.
Okay.
You just said. Yeah.
Oh, well, in the side of the other, that's because the status of the other, yes, there's a triadic logic for both Girard and for Freud and Lacan, but they're different. How close they are, I think Bort Jacobson is the one who has shown how different they are. He's shown that best because he's the Girardian who's a psychoanalyst, and he's written the most on this topic. You know, way more than Girard, way more, right? In a certain sense, Girard is kind of scant what he writes about psychoanalysis. He only comments on it. You know what I mean? But he doesn't really dig into how his system differentiates from Lacan, for example. He doesn't do that. So, yeah, there's a lot of overlap there because Girard says it's triangular as well, you know? So I feel like what we should do is graph. It would be fun to graph some of it out. There's the chapter here, which is called, what is it? It's like literally called Triangle. What is it? Oh no, that's in the other text. In Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, it's the triangular nature of desire. So anyways, why don't we step back and see, what do you think about guiding us through chapter 4 on the origin of myth and ritual?
As I said, I mean, I'm used to kind of reading together. So maybe either we could each of us take a few pages,
Okay.
and or each of us, you know, give our understandings,
Okay.
share what was important for us in this, the origins of myth and ritual.
Sure. Yeah, feel free. If anybody wants to jump in, please just, you know, dive in and make any kind of opening comment about the chapter. I would be more than welcome. I'm preparing for another presentation tomorrow, so I apologize. I haven't been as good about reading this week.
Yeah.
So something that struck me at the beginning of the chapter is he again goes back to Uber and Mouse.
Yeah.
And he's basically asking, in their famous article, Sacrifice, Its Nature and Function, like, what is it that's missing, right? And he actually says that their understanding of ritual and myth and relate, he says on page, and I have a different pagination, I'm sorry, but he says it's no longer a question of relating ritual to myth or even myth to ritual. Such procedures invariably produced a circular train of argument, right? So he's saying there's something about Uber and Mouse's argument around sacrifice that kind of these things are cyclical, and I'm instead trying to look for something that is he says at the center of the circle, not at the periphery. But then he also says, but it's also, I don't want to, and I believe he's alluding to psychoanalysis here, I don't believe that the conclusion that the center is totally inaccessible or that there's no center at all is helpful. So he's trying to think then, what is the thingness of sacrifice and what does it do? And what are some things, again, going back to Oedipus and Freud, but then also in different African, and then it's like kind of ethnographic again, African understandings of royal incest. Like what does that reveal about the nature of sacrifice and the violence that's bound up that hasn't been spoken exactly?
Right. And he's also asking the question, which he's trying to prove, and he thinks that he has proved it, that the surrogate victim is the one who can, quote, interrupt the destructuring process. Therefore, the surrogate victim is at the origin of the structure. So that's super significant, I feel like. And what that means is that you could take any mythical narrative and identify the surrogate victim within it. And it is one of those theories which is kind of nice. Like I was thinking, just as an aside, there's this philosopher called Alain Badiou, and he has a theory of the event. However, in his theory of the event, the truth is he has not come up with a slogan for it. He confesses, like, I have no marketing slogan for what I mean by the event. It's unfortunately too complex for me to be able to do that. But isn't it kind of nice that, or obvious why, or that Girard rather does have like a lot of slogans, And it made me realize that a lot of our favorite philosophers lack slogans, right? And I think this is an example of a really successful slogan of a theory. And
Which?
Every mythical system has within it a surrogate victim at its origin, and which describes its structure. It's an incredibly clear claim. You don't need to be an academic or a specialist in anthropology, ethnology, Greek tragedy, etc., right? Native American folklore. You don't need that. You now have a model that you can then just go off and play with, right? So it's an incredibly robust theory. So yeah, I don't know if that's a strength. I think it's funny that a lot of continental philosophers see it as a weakness because they see clarity as a weakness. Right? A little bit. Come on, let's be honest. A little bit they do. I'm serious.
And I think, by the way, which page does he say that on? What?
93 in my copy.
Okay.
I don't mean to be too mean, but I do think that there is a, okay, if you take somebody like Lacan, since Kaya mentioned him before, Lacan has all these statements, which is no one understands me, for example, right? But he's saying that in a positive, affirmative sense, right? I do not like speak to be understood, things like this, kind of elusive, but he actually means something very precise by saying that, you know. So there's that aspect of it, but then there's another aspect, which is you know, I think that a lot of philosophers do a bad job of describing their central idea, right? I mean, maybe it's a paradox. Maybe like if you take différance from Derrida, he can spend 4 hours extemporaneously talking about différance in a myriad of examples, from 1990s vampire films to Shakespeare to Plato, right? So it's all quite clear. Yet when we look at it from a certain distance, it eludes the soundbite, right? It's not really condensable. But Girard's theory is an extremely condensed thing. And I think actually what that is possibly a resistance of theoretical language to capitalism, to the commodification of the theory, you see? Because if you keep the theory, say, of différance or of the event for Badiou, if you keep the theory as a kind of project that necessitates a kind of intellectual investment in, you see my point? It becomes non-commodifiable. There's no one slogan for it. So there's a certain value. It's not so much clarity or lack of clarity. It's probably a resistance to commodification. I don't think Girard cares about commodification. I don't think that that's a problem for him. Yeah. Sorry for that tirade, but does that make sense, what I'm saying?
It makes a lot of sense. And also something that I've felt kind of in a very similar vein to that is that something that's very accessible with Girard's theory in this way is that it gets to kind of remain in a very linear temporality of the story. Like with Oedipus, you have this one isolated thing, and therefore you can identify the surrogate victim. And
Right.
You go to this other ethnographic example and you identify the surrogate victim, and then you move on, it's really interesting to me because it seems to me again that Girard is trying to give some kind of way forward for a liberal, democratic, judicial society in which there are many temporalities and communities and everything intertwined constantly. So I'd be able to identify a particular sacrificial or surrogate victim within a modern state like France or the United States or wherever. It's really, I'm still kind of interested in what he's trying to do because it seems so much more interwoven in a way than these like very particular nice textual examples that he gives.
Yes. Very fine point. I like that so much. Yeah. Yes.
And that it's funny, I came in today thinking I finally, after many weeks of feeling like grasping for a foothold, I finally have a feeling of clarity. Now I'm back where I started. Right, he talked about the circular reasoning, which is actually how he opened the book, if you remember.
Yeah.
And then he spoke about the circle, the center, or the. But my thinking was that it's the entire circle. There is not even a nodal point. There's no escape. So I'm not even sure what would mean to have it to find a point at the center or off center.
Yeah, that's actually a nice point. That reminds me of Peter Thiel's argument apropos a business, which is a practical example, but a kind of strange homeostasis. Like, did you notice that, like, yes, Girard is not afraid of the slogan or sloganeering aspects of his thought, but there's a downside to that, which is that your followers declare your project to be done, right? And if you listen to his followers, that's how they talk about him. And I think this is a very kind of sine qua non, or a sort of a very, very standard way that conservative intellectuals gain followers, which is that there's no project to be continued. There is a kind of only thing to be continued is a sort of celebration of the original discovery, you see?
Mm.
In that sense, if you compare Girard to someone like Badiou, one of the nice things about Badiou is that Badiou is a figure who sets all of these other young philosophers free to go do completely different things, kind of influenced by some indications of that he opens for them. Nothing more than that. It's not like he has an army of philosophers that believe in the event. It's ludicrous, right? But
Not yet.
but Girard, on the other hand, with Thiel, did you notice? Thiel says what Girard taught us was that we had to internally know or gain the knowledge of the mimetic potential for violence that was sort of intrinsic to our company, and therefore we created new roles for people to not conditions of envy to break out and stuff like that, right? And then what we did was we realized that external competition is bad. And what then happens? He becomes
A market.
Well, no. He basically becomes a kind of pro-feudal capitalist, pro-monopolist. And that's what he is. He's a pro-monopolist. So there is no more competition. Actually, competition is something we should foreclose. Every business should become and maybe compete for a time. But the means by which they compete to achieve their greatness, of course, he's a Trump supporter in a huge way. That violent struggle, the task that Girard teaches us is to clean up our own internal harmony, which will allow us to be victorious over the others. Once we are victorious, we should remain there. We remain there, competition's done. So you have a sort of reversion to feudal stability, distinction.
Only inside the company.
No, in the market. The market is a monopoly. So we have Bezos, we have Thiel, we have these different...
But different companies still competing.
We have winners who had won, they had competed, but they succeeded because they knew the mimetic formula internally. Because the mimetic formula, he said, doesn't really have much to tell us about external competition. So there's this whole internal, external thing. So that was my reading of Thiel. It's just very kind of dark or kind of like strange. I don't know, like it's right.
That's really interesting because I was thinking that you went right to Thiel.
Huh?
I was thinking in terms of my question that about the circle and the center of the circle. I was thinking something in relation to this is why Girard is beloved by conservatives because he gives them, the best pretext with which to bemoan and complain about the decline of religion, etc. And somehow, in this misreading, I haven't fully understood, but it's obviously directly we're thinking on the same lines.
I think so. I think we can talk about the Thiel example and like Girard and capitalism maybe later. But one thing I wanted to point out in the origins of myth and ritual, which I think is towards a Marxist reading of Girard here, because if Oedipus is a story of like an individual secular heroism of myth, I actually think that when he uses the example of the pharmakon, of pharmakos, which is the population, which we can refer to as lumpen proletariat in modern capitalist order. He says on page 95 that if my thesis is correct, the pharmakos, these people that are like Agamben would call bare life, are basically just like Oedipus. So therefore, they are abject. They are nothing. They are filth. They are they are deaths of despair. They are this, they are that, right? They are no representation. They have no wage labor, etc., right? They are worthless. But then they also possess the surrogate, quasi-secular, redemptive quality, right? So then I wanted to tease that out a little bit, because that was a question I opened up in our very first session. And now he's sort of getting at it. So here's what he says. He says, on the one hand, the pharmakos is a woebegone figure, an object of scorn, who is also weighed down with guilt, a butt for all sorts of jibes, insults, and outbursts of violence. On the other hand, we find him surrounded by a quasi-religious aura of veneration. He has become a sort of cult object. This duality reflects the metamorphosis the ritual victim is designed to effect. The victim draws to itself all the violence infecting the original victim, and through its own death transforms this baneful violence into beneficial violence, into harmony and abundance. So that's pretty wild, man. I mean, I think, first of all, I want to point out the...
What page were you reading from?
Sorry, this is my edition. It's the John Hopkins one.
It's 100 on the PDF.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's 95 in the book.
That's right, 95 in the book. That's what I'm at. The 100.
So there's a 5-page difference between the two documents.
Okay, there you go. So you see the one that if my thesis is correct, the pharmakos like Oedipus, you see that?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at. So here we go. Pharmakon in classical Greek means both poison and the antidote for poison, both sickness and cure. In short, I love this shit. I love this so much. In short, any substance capable of perpetrating a very good or very bad action, according to the circumstances and the dosage. There's so much here. Addiction, drugs, like fucking sub-proletariat. The pharmakon is thus a magic drug or a volatile elixir, whose administration had best be left by ordinary men in the hands of those who enjoy special knowledge and exceptional powers, priests, magicians, shamans, doctors, and so on. Wow. So the comparison of Oedipus and pharmakos is not meant to imply that we accept the views of certain scholars, most notably the Cambridge ritualists. I'm going to make a note on that. I don't know what that is.
Okay.
Who have proposed
I think that's Evans Pritchard, maybe.
Oh, is that right?
I think so.
Who have proposed a purely ritualistic interpretation of tragedy. It is evident that the Oedipus myth is intimately associated with rites analogous to those involving the pharmakos. Yeah? And also, we might add, the rites of religion, like we already talked about. But we must take care not to confuse the myth and ritual, on the one hand, with the essentially anti-mythical and anti-ritualistic inspiration of the drama on the other. So here he goes. So blah, blah, blah. The season of death, resurrection. Okay. So yeah, that's the point. Okay, so it's not symbolized. The death of pharmakos is not reducible to a symbolism of the rite of, fall to winter, for example, or something like that is what he's trying to say. It still, the sacrifice is the centerpiece. Yeah? Nature enters the picture later when the ritualistic mind succeeds in detecting certain similarities between nature's rhythms and the community's alternating pattern or order. The modus operandi of violence, sometimes reciprocal and pernicious, and sometimes beneficial, is then taken as the model for the entire universe. Okay.
What does he mean when he says the sole possible model remains a sacrificial crisis and its resolution? He's saying it's outside of nature. What's?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, it's outside nature because it's outside of the symbolism of man's relationship to nature. That symbol.
It's almost as if it's like that which cannot be symbolized for man.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean,
It's the excess.
isn't the surrogate victim the symbolization of the of that?
No, that not in that way. I mean, I'm talking about, like, in Beyond talks about attacks on linking, and that in moments of excess trauma or affectation, no longer able to symbolize, and that itself is the violence. That is the
Oh, I see. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, the procedure leading up to the
Right.
moment is a breakdown
And-
of principle. Yeah.
And he's saying how this is not ritualistic. We're not worshiping or celebrating other rhythms found around us. This is precisely that which makes us uniquely human, and that no other I mean, right now we're symbolizing it. We're looking at it from as an observer, but no other animal has this need. Those who crucified Jesus didn't do it for a symbolic meaning. They did it because they had the need for a scapegoat.
Right. Yeah, so surrogate victim is synonymous with scapegoat. We should remember that, because he makes a pivot just to refer one to the other, right? So,
Yeah. Okay.
So again, the clarity of Girard comes through. That's helpful, because he says a little bit further down, this unique mechanism structures all cultural values, even as it conceals itself behind them. It is associated even more fundamentally with the double-edged images of myths and rituals. Sophocles appends nothing to the scapegoat theme. Its broader meaning is not simply tacked on, nor has the tragic poet, on his own initiative, turned Oedipus into a reflection of the human condition. So okay, that makes sense. Scapegoat effects are more deeply rooted in the human condition than we are willing to admit. Yeah.
Still.
Okay. So you have to read the footnote. Footnote number 5. A number of French scholars have detected in the Oedipus of both myth and tragedy a pharmakos and a scapegoat. According to Marie Delcourt, the institution of the scapegoat explains the fate of the infant Oedipus abandoned by his parents. Oedipus is offered as a scapegoat by a father called Laius, that is to say, Publius, the representative of the people. The murder by exposure of weak or ill-formed infants was extremely widespread and is certainly associated with the concept of the surrogate victim, that is, with the unanimous basis of all sacrificial rites. It is the indication of that unanimity among the general populace that Marie Delcourt has touched upon here. So the idea that Oedipus is a stand-in for pharmakos, which is the condition of a wide swath of people, is being rejected in favor of the structural thesis of the structural necessity of scapegoat, which precedes that, right? That, like, I think he's saying is that very well may be the case, but there's a clearer account in my account than what she's providing here. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was mentioned earlier that Oedipus, as the sacrificial victim, was partly guilty. But child sacrifice, children are not guilty; they're innocent. So, is there a difference, a duality of the different types of sacrificial victim to be talked about? Those who are innocent and those who are partly not innocent.
Well, at what point is Oedipus guilty? Before he does the act, or?
Oh, it was mentioned by Levi earlier. It wasn't my point. It was,
Well,
I mean, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think, well, with Oedipus specifically, what's interesting is that he is given away by his parents because he's already presumed to be guilty, right?
By
The oracle says that he will kill his father and sleep with his mother.
Yeah, it's the
So he's
oracle
already
that
guilty.
imposes the guilt.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
But there's two different plays of guilt. There's a kind of, maybe three actually. There's the oracle's thrownness of the guilt. There's the act to transcend it, and then there's the existence after it. So I think that isn't it actually the case that, how old is he when he receives the oracle? Is he a child? He's not a child. He's kind of a young man, right? Isn't that the whole point? I don't think
That was after the oracle was already after the plague, and he was king and everything.
Yeah, the oracle comes later. Okay,
Yeah.
right. Okay. So yes. So Pharmakos and the execution of Pharmakos is a long-standing motif in Greek mythology. And a lot of people have read that in two ways. One would be a kind of human condition, and the other one would be as man's relationship to nature, something like this. Kind of like, you'll see this in Dionysius, because Dionysius becomes, so what is the celebration of Dionysius? Right? It's connected something of the human condition, of pleasure, enjoyment, catharsis, excess, etc., to a natural cosmos, right? And the kind of way in which it maps onto that, right? So anyways.
I'm just interested myself in this question of whether the sacrificial victim is innocent or guilty in the function it performs, in its
that's a good question.
in its way of dealing with violence, you know. And it's not just a question of obviously being perceived as guilty. It might be different from actually being innocent, actually being guilty, you know. How important is it?
I said, of course, it's different in religious settings.
Well, yeah.
So Jonathan, when you say the function it performs, you mean in the perception of the community?
In the resolution of violence within the community, which is the purpose of the sacrificial victim, and the purpose of the scapegoating, isn't it, to discharge or resolve violence? That's my understanding. And so, how important is it for the sacrificial victim to be innocent or guilty in this operation, as it were? Would be something I'm interested in. Because I always thought that the whole point of the sacrificial victim was that they were innocent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep.
Not that they were guilty, you know, because otherwise it's just punishment, isn't it? I mean, they deserve it. It doesn't symbolize something beyond themselves.
But for Girard, we're seeing that there's never, like Levi said in the beginning, you know, there's never an instance where there's a great line in Ethics of Our Fathers. It's a Talmudic tractate. It says, there are two rabbis standing on a riverside, and they saw two skulls floating down the river. One rabbi said to the other, that skull killed the other because the other had killed a third. And this skull, who had killed the other, will in turn have his killer will have been killed, and so on.
You're talking about a kind of universal guilt. That's
universal justice and guilt. Yeah. Well, I think they're trying to say, you know, God has everything evened out on the ledger.
right.
I do think it's important to note, kind of along with Chaim there, that when Girard opens the book, he explicitly asks, what are the failings in some sense of our judicial institutions? And to turn to Oedipus then is, I think, to say that actually we're in a moment in which if we have some kind of sacrificial process that Girard is suggesting, it's one in which we identify a guilty party to sacrifice, not an innocent one. So thinking in modern, like, again, liberal states or communities or whatever, the term that Girard is thinking in, he's thinking about a guilty sacrificial victim. Which I think is why he uses the word scapegoat, right? So often he turns to scapegoat because it implies a kind of guilt imbued upon rather than an innocent sacrifice. Like they could be innocent, but it doesn't matter. The community sees them as guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Right. That's right.
Like, you know, in sacrifice, the whole idea was, you know, that the animal would be unspotted, without blemish, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Temple. I mean, it has to be innocent, you know, otherwise, isn't it about the projection or the dumping of community's guilt onto the innocent?
Yeah, that goes back to his distinction between pure and impure violence, and that there is in religious sacrificial rites and ceremonies the extraction of a pure and a mixing with an impure as a kind of balancing of the scales. So it's absolutely true that in many religious rites the surrogate victim has to be pure. That is true.
Yeah.
So it has to do with the balancing of the scales of purity and impurity. But I think, though, in Oedipus, it's a different dynamic, actually. And I think Levi is correct about that.
Okay.
Analyze that, yeah.
And this is where he's going to start talking about the Jewish sacrifice. I did a bunch of research on this. This is obviously a key, pretty much the key motif in the Bible, animal sacrifice. And I wanted to read.
Yeah, share your research with us, please.
Let's see. I wanted to start. Was there anything else between here and 106 that you wanted to speak to?
Before we get to this section called the function of sacrifice.
Yeah. I was just going to read the next those couple pages there. They're a key passage for me.
Go ahead.
So nothing else before that? Okay. There's surely no harm in pausing a moment. Oh, and I'll read on page 102 on the next page. My hypothesis is becoming at once broader and more precise. It should permit us to see through certain previously impenetrable religious acts, such as the execution of the pharmakos, and to discern their perfectly intelligible aims. As we'll soon discover, this same hypothesis pertains not only to rites as a general category, but also to their most minute details. Hitherto, I've examined only those sacrifices that involve human victims. The link between the rite and the functioning of violence and unanimity is especially apparent when the original victim also happens to have been a human being. In such instances, the effort at imitation is easy to discern. I don't think I understood that paragraph.
Can you speak again?
Was there anything important there? Yeah, he says, my hypothesis is becoming at once broader and more precise. It should permit us to see through certain previously impenetrable religious acts, such as the execution of the pharmakos, and discern their perfectly intelligible aims. As we'll discover, this same hypothesis pertains also to rites as a general category, but also to their most minute details. So hitherto, I have examined only those sacrifices that involve human victims. The link between the rite and the functioning of violent unanimity is especially apparent when the original victim also happens to have been a human being. In such instances, the effort at imitation is easy to discern. We should now, maybe it'll become clear, we should now ask ourselves whether animal sacrifices too cannot be defined as a mimesis of an initial collective murder. In my first chapter, I suggested there was no essential difference between human and animal sacrifice. If this is true, the origin of all sacrifices must be the same. The celebrated Judaic scapegoat and all animal sacrifices of the same type lend strong support to my hypothesis. But there is surely no harm in pausing a moment longer to examine a classical case of animal sacrifice in order to demonstrate, if possible, its direct connotation with the execution of a surrogate victim. If it can be shown that the sacrificial rites are indeed striving to reproduce the mechanism of violent unanimity, and that the surrogate victim is indeed the key to all these rites, considerable new light will be shed on the matter of animal sacrifice. And it's interesting to note that the scapegoat he talks about, the Judaic scapegoat, is in the Yom Kippur service once a year. There's actually two. There's a double. So one is there's a lottery, and they pick the Kohen, the high priest picks out of a hat. One goes off the cliff. It's called Azazel. That's where we get the word Azazel for hell, for the depths. And the other is sacrificed on the altar. So they both have the same fate, essentially. So I'm going to skip this, and we have an interesting discussion coming up on 106. Any comments so far?
Yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about there with the victims of the sacrifice. It's almost like on one hand, one is thought to be pure and sort of put on a high place to sort of think about the benefits and all the nice things, and the other is thrown off the cliff, and it's just nothing we can do with it. So it's almost like there's a paradoxical element there, it sounds like. And what Girard, I think, is saying is that the surrogate victim represents the community. So on one hand, that's the paradox of the violence as well. You have one that's sort of beneficial and the other that's sort of violent and bad. It sounds like, I mean, first thought.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really helpful.
I was sorry.
Yeah. And right, it's literally the altar it's going up to the altar, and then the other one's going down.
Right. It might help with the later myths that come along of religion, to say, here's the aim, but here's the problem.
Why in Abrahamic religions or in other religions is animal sacrifice? I understand that it has the same scapegoat logic, but is it not also the case that it is a repetition of the original sacrifice, which is at play with animal sacrifice? In other words, can animal sacrifice ever be originary? Like, in other words, isn't animal sacrifice always kind of like let's call it like a kind of performance? Because it's not as meaningful as the original. Do you see what I'm saying? It's kind of like, does that make sense what I'm saying to you? Especially in Abrahamic faith traditions. Maybe there's other animal sacrifices which are more primary or more original. But do you see what I'm saying? Because if that's true, then doesn't that kind of maybe butt against Girard's argument, which is that the animal is basically a symbolic stand-in, and he's very much opposed to this notion of symbol stand-in, right? Thing, and but isn't it true that is what is at play with the animal sacrifice? That it's a kind of symbolic dramatization of something more original that happened prior.
Well, I think what Girard might be trying to say is that that's already a shift. Instead of sort of taking the human as a direct substitute, we can sort of take an animal because we built in this mechanism of religion. So already that's a shift away from being violent toward ourselves. It's now being violent towards a substitute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're still affecting. There is some kind of a double there, though. Yeah. Between the human, and the animal. So yes. It's still effective for the desire for blood.
Yes. And the question, I think, too, is like, I think what Daniel, you're trying to say is that relationship primary. And so if it is, if like we sort of have to kill animals to eat, or if we sort of, I don't know how far back you go to kind of figure out this violence.
It's almost like blood is the, now we have a third family. A real animal sacrifice.
There you go. Plus dog spelled backwards is God.
Is that a puppy?
No, actually,
Congratulations. Looks like you got a new dog.
it's full grown.
Oh,
Pretty
See.
cute.
Okay, no, but the bloodletting, because blood is so elemental, so primary, so you could call it symbolic, but it's, remember in I think at the end of chapter 1, he'll say that the bloodletting dialectic of purity impurity is he basically says this is my best argument for what I'm trying to say. So therefore, maybe it's the fact that the animal bleeds and the blood that they give as a gift is so maybe very much part of that logic of animal sacrifice. That might be another part of it. I don't know.
Well, I think what you are hitting upon something, Daniel, is a similar something that I've also been trying to figure out, which is Girard, when he's speaking about sacrifice, it is always because of internal strife within the community.
Yeah.
To bring an animal into the sacrificial process is to bring something exterior to the community
Yeah.
into it.
That's right.
Which, yeah, I think it's a great question to ask then. Like, how do we contemplate animal sacrifice in Girard then?
mhm.
Right. Well,
Why can't it be an inanimate object?
well,
Is that what you're saying?
yeah.
Well, if the point of sacrifice that Girard is trying to get to in a secular sacrifice in which the dissolution of a particular community because of an internal violence and problem is happening, you need an internal scapegoat or surrogate victim. So to move to an animal.
Yeah, but isn't pharmakos an animal effectively?
Wait a minute.
You see
Okay,
why.
yeah.
You see why?
Okay,
Because
yeah.
they're subhuman. Like
Yeah.
this is like Nietzsche's whole
Mhm.
biologization of figures of resentment. Figures of resentment ultimately are eligible for eugenic elimination.
Mhm.
Eugenic, yeah,
Mhm.
removal. It's a refinement of pharmakos, right? Immanentized on a playing field of will to power, right? You can sort of imminently derive those eligible for extinction or for removal, eugenic removal. So, but there's still the logic of the outside, like the animal, right?
And I'm not sure.
Oedipus is not. Oedipus, that's why Oedipus is unique. He's not pharmakos.
But isn't
right.
the power, when he's talking about pharmakos, isn't part of what he says is not just that they're impure, but that there's an identification there that they also have some sense of where is the passage that you read?
Oh yeah, that was such a nice.
Yeah. On the other hand, we find him surrounded by quasi-religious aura of veneration. He's a sort of cult object. So it's not just an outside in which he's animalistic. It also, if we're talking about the lumpen proletariat or something like that, is the thing that holds kind of the best of us.
Well, that's also why the animal has to be a certain kind of animal. Like it has to be
Without blemish.
Everybody says about the animal that's eligible for sacrifice. It actually has to ideally be the one that's most human-like, closest to anthropogenic, something like that.
One more thing that Agamben points out about animal sacrifice is it helps maintain the hierarchy of man at the top. So kind of like you're saying with a different class of people to be sacrificial victims, you can also choose an animal because they don't have an option. And that way you're separating yourself from them. You're saying we're superior, they're inferior. We can do kind of what we want. And that helps sort of create a distinction of man to say, I'm separate from the animal. I'm not like the animal. I'm different. I'm better.
Are you guys familiar with this really incredible anthropologist theorist named Viveiros das Castro? He's like a Brazilian guy, and he's living right now, but he's written this book, which is an interpretation of Deleuze and Guattari's anthropological theories. And he basically gives us a kind of radical post-humanist understanding of the man-nature, man-animal relation. I've read parts of it, but it is, I don't know, Levi, if you're familiar with it, but it is some really incredible work. It's one of those pieces of work which will probably be realized in like decades to come as an incredibly significant contribution. It already
Yes.
is now, but it's just not like I feel like it's kind of niche.
What's the title?
Hold on, I'll tell you in 1 second. Yeah, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, and from the enemy's point of view, humanity and divinity in an Amazonian society. So it's about alterity, and it's about a re-understanding of how the Amazonian people present a completely different theory of evil and of otherness than the Western cosmos. In essence, it's but again, it's primarily working with Deleuze and Guattari.
So, and in response to Ben, for Girard, he says on the top of 102 that the sacrificial rites are striving to reproduce the mechanism of violent unanimity, and right, he says that that's somehow, I mean, that's the part that's fuzzy to me. The key to all these rites is simply to not to symbolize, to reproduce the functioning of violent unanimity. So that's something different, perhaps, than superiority or pecking order.
Well, also too, I think it's to try to forget about it. So if you sort of do it enough and it represents the right thing and it's a substitute, you don't really have to think much about it. It just happens and you can kind of go your own way, and it's kind of over there and we're kind of over here. So I think too,
it's a very anti-cosmopolitan philosophy in a certain sense, because again, going back to the more basic Peter Thiel example, like where is the Kantian cosmopolitanism that might come from communities which have solved this issue? There's no theory in Girard that extends to the global scene, right? It's a very kind of refracted inward toolkit that we're given, I think. And I kind of worry that there's sort of this kind of a failure to think. I mean, I'm almost even thinking of what makes part of this conservative is it seems to me that the impulse of the mastery of the mimetic desire would lead to further fragmentation across institutions and so on, a kind of siloization. This is the impression that I'm getting.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And
yeah, kind of
is
like
this
a libertarian type of a ordeal where the strongest prevails, sort of.
Everyone's in their private spheres and sort of,
Yes.
kind of an ethics of distance and
Yes.
and I think that it's like the last thing that we need. This is the this is the proposal of the right-wing accelerationists, right? Which is embrace fragmentation as much as possible and so on.
Yeah.
Is this how you're understanding on the bottom of 101, metamorphosis of reciprocal violence into restraining violence?
Right.
That's right. That's I'm hearing you describing that we're not solving the question of violence. We're somehow turning it from reciprocal to restraining violence. This is it. This is you get your little bit of violence every year, and then we can live. And I was thinking, why is it an animal? Why can't it be an inanimate object? That's exactly what we're doing now. We're destroying the environment as a sacrifice, and we see that we're all able to live somewhat in peace. And we're willfully, consciously, brazenly destroying the ecosystem around us, almost as if it needs must be in order for us to live together the way we do.
Right.
And you could think about that as sort of another step on the separation or substitution of things where we're at the top. We're sort of gods and we can kind of do what we want. And so everything else is sort of not important.
And it is true, though,
Mhm.
right? Our welfare, for us to live in peace and not in war, it's worth it to destroy the world.
Yeah.
So Kubrick, you're suggesting there's an evolution of sacrifice from
Yeah.
from ourselves, an object of our own equality, like humans, towards animals, and then towards inanimate objects.
Yeah.
Maybe is that a good development or a bad development, or is that an irrelevant question?
Well, I think it depends. You could see it both ways, really. And maybe it's a transference, which is a Freudian interpretation, but and I think Girard would kind of acknowledge it and say it is better.
Right. To go towards the animate,
Right.
and towards the human.
Right.
The animate. Why? Why would he say that?
Well, I think because we're using substitutions and symbolization to extract ourselves from being violent toward each other.
Right.
As the original act of violence, I guess.
Jonathan, we spoke about Badiou. Do you have any thoughts about Badiou coming in here on violence or on identity? No?
Not in relation to this subject. No,
Okay.
I think, does Daniel, do you have any, can you bring Badiou into Girard at all? I wouldn't see a connection myself.
I think that for the logics of sacrifice that we're dealing with here in Badiou, I'd have to think about it. I mean, let me see here. I think that Badiou's not really interested in the direction of analysis that Girard is taking, which is one that is centered around the maintenance of a quelling of stasis. Like, I think that the direction by which Badiou's project orientates itself is so fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, on the other hand, Badiou is somebody who is also very much influenced by a theory of psychoanalytic desire, and who will form an ethics of that's influenced by psychoanalytic desire. And I think Girard's kind of close to this, right? So there may be something at that point, but I think that their alterity of their theory of the subject are very different from one another, right? Very different. I think in Badiou's theory of the subject, you have a subject which is formed close to the Foucauldian formation of the subject, but not exactly in this kind of transgressive moment of power. There's a different origin of the subject. It is a subject that's marked by an event and then experiences traces of this event as a kind of fidelity. And then there kind of is a virtue that comes from the fidelity that comes in the wake of this, right? So to what extent maybe if you really want to riff on this, we can. I mean, to what extent is a Badiouian event close to a sacrificial event, right? Or is an event, in the myriad of ways Badiou means this term, is that at all analogous to the necessity of a sacrificial event? And I think that the answer is no, it's not the same thing, because for Badiou, the event is an exception to the law.
Yeah.
And it is not something which brings about a homeostasis. He says that an event creates an alternative law, It creates a different procedure from the dominant state of the situation. It creates what he calls a site, where evental subjects develop a kind of fidelity to what they created imminently in the world, right? And so then he can retroactively look back in history and identify communities that bring about these outlaw moments, but not outlaw in a thing like they're criminals, not like that, but outlaw in the sense that an artist is an outlaw when he or she pushes the envelope of what's permissible in the discourse of art at a given time. In that sense, they're an outlaw, right? And an artist produces an event which pushes the boundaries of the law of art, right? So, and same with love. Love is also couldn't be seen. So it's a very different model of philosophy, I feel like.
I guess you can talk a little bit. I mean, in Badiou about the, in the event and in the formation of the new truth procedures, you involve the loss of the old. The loss of classical music with new music, and the loss of. So you could see it in terms of a sacrifice, maybe in a more colloquial sense of the meaning of the word, in the sense of giving up or moving beyond. And who knows, maybe that relates into the obscure subject trying to cling on to the old and deny the event by refusing the sacrifice.
Yeah.
By refusing the giving up of the old.
Yeah. Badiou, yeah, that's right. I think that's.
But yeah, sacrifice is not a word that Badiou uses, and it's not. He's not interested in this homeostasis. He's interested in transformation, to radical change.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. He's interested in novelty and right.
Yeah.
So then again, I feel as if both figures are marked by a kind of historical material. Like we should read them. I'm more and more convinced we need to read philosophers in the following way. You must take the biographical somewhat seriously. And by that, I mean, like, who is René Girard? Well, René Girard is a kind of product of the post-war period of the Cold War. What was the overarching objective of the Cold War? It was to sort of find a way out, right? To sort of, you see what I mean? Like, I think that structuralism was a part of cybernetics. Cybernetics was about a creation of a world order which would eliminate the possibility of a return to the horror of the Second and First World Wars, right? So I feel like Badiou is a person who is witnessing the tail end of a series of revolutions. I mean, the Chinese Cultural Revolution hit its mark 1 year before the French Revolution of May 1968, right? Or uprising. So he's coming at it from this angle, right? So they're both marked in this way. They're both going to be creating something from these lived experiences, if you like. I mean, I know I hate that term, but you see what I mean? There's a historical contextualization, I think, that you'd have to put into play there.
Sure, but Badiou's biggest, most famous work, being an event, has come out of a disenchantment with the failure of the Red Years.
Sure.
Later. That's, yeah. So.
True, but I mean, it's still very much marked by it.
Sure.
There's a disenchantment, but all of that's kind of like a retroactive learning, and that's actually that's actually what I think gives Badiou his brilliance, which is, I like the fact that he's a puritanical Maoist in his youth, who, unlike the metaphysics of conservatives who see an individual's ideology as sacrosanct and stalled or fixed, right? For a conservative, one's ideology is permanent. I am a Thomist. There's no question, right? But if you are a Badiouian, there is implicit in that is a kind of project, right? Of a kind of
acceptance for change, an acceptance for development.
Fundamental experimentation, right?
Yeah.
A fundamental experimentation relation, I feel like, where there's all kinds of things that need to be worked out. And the question of the in Meditation 10 and being an event, he addresses the question of violence, but it's from a completely different angle than which Girard. It's playing with different dynamics. Anyways.
Just one comment on that, though, because one thing I'm thinking of where there's maybe not exactly an intersection, but where you could maybe contrast them is, it's been a little bit, but I remember in Beju's 5 lessons on Wagner, if I remember correctly, it seemed like a lot of his emphasis in that book was around this idea of like, is there a ritual of modernity, and seeing like Wagner's Parsifal as like the like most recent like closest attempt of instilling something like that. And I guess I could read that as somewhat of Beju's response of um a, a a crisis in ritualization, if not necessarily a crisis in sacrifice.
I love that. Thank you for reminding. I haven't read that text actually. I'd love to take a look at that. Very interesting. Yeah.
In the last few minutes, I want to read this page from 106. How much time do we have left?
We have about 6 minutes.
Okay.
I make a suggestion that next week we all use the same text just for page reasons, or
Sure.
I mean, is everyone using the PDF from Daniel?
I was using a book.
I mean, it doesn't matter, but it's.
Yeah, I can agree to that for sure.
Because otherwise, I have to use you have to use the find function on the PDF to find. Complicated.
Yeah, so I'm on the PDF. Do I have time to get into this a bit, or do we need to finish up? Okay. The function of sacrifice, as defined in Chapter 1, not only allows for but requires a surrogate victim. In other words, violent unanimity. In ritual sacrifice, the victim, when actually put to death, diverts violence from its forbidden objectives within the community. But for whom precisely is this victim substituted? Heretofore, we could only conceive of this substitution in terms of the individual psychological mechanisms, which clearly do not provide an adequate picture of the process. If there were no surrogate victim to transform the sacrifice from an essentially private concern into one involving the whole community, we would be obliged to regard the victim as a substitute for particular individuals who have somehow provoked the sacrificer's anger. If the transfer is purely personal, as it is in psychoanalysis, then sacrifice cannot be a true social institution involving the entire community. But sacrifice, as we know, is essentially a communal institution. Individualization marks a later decadent stage in its evolution, a development contrary to its original spirit. To understand how and why sacrifice functions as it does, we should consider the proposition that the ritual victim is never substituted for some particular member of the community, or even for the community as a whole. It is always substituted for the surrogate victim, as this victim itself serves as a substitute for all the members of the community. Right, he's repeated this many times now. The sacrificial substitution does not play the role that we have attributed to it, protecting all the members of the community from their respective violence, but always through the intermediary of the surrogate victim. This observation should clear me of any suspicion of psychologizing while eliminating a serious objection to basing the present theory on sacrificial substitution. If the entire community were not already subsumed under a single head, that of the surrogate victim, it would be impossible to attribute to the sacrificial substitution the significance we have claimed for it, impossible to establish a social basis for the institution. The original act of violence is unique and spontaneous. Ritual sacrifices, however, are multiple, endlessly repeated. All those aspects of the original act that had escaped man's control, the choice of time and place, the selection of the victim, are now premeditated and fixed by custom. The ritual process aims at removing all element of chance and seeks to extract from the original violence some technique of cathartic appeasement. The diluted force of the sacrificial ritual cannot be attributed to imperfections in its imitative technique. After all, the rite is designed to function during periods of relative calm. As we've seen, its role is not curative, but preventative. If it were more effective, than it in fact is, if it did not limit itself to appropriate sacrificial victims, but instead, like the original act of violence, vented its force on a participating member of the community, then it would lose all effectiveness, for it would bring to pass the very thing it was supposed to prevent, a relapse into the sacrificial crisis. The murder is it's abnormal and normative. The sacrificial process is as fully adapted to its normative function as collective murder is to its abnormal and normative function. There is every reason to believe that the minor catharsis of the sacrificial act is derived from that major catharsis circumscribed by collective murder. Ritual sacrifice is founded on a double substitution. The first, which passes unperceived, is a substitution of one member of the community for all, brought about through the operation of the surrogate victim. The second, the only truly ritualistic substitution, is superimposed on the first. It is a substitution of a victim belonging to a predetermined sacrificial category for the original victim. The surrogate victim comes from inside the community, and the ritual victim must come from outside. Otherwise, the community might find it difficult to unite against it. How, it may be asked, does the second substitution graft itself onto the first? How does the original violence succeed in imposing a centrifugal force on the right? In short, how does the sacrificial technique operate? I will attempt to return to these questions, but at this point, I wish to draw attention to the essentially mimetic character of sacrifice with regard to the original generative act of violence. Thanks to this mimetic aspect, we can understand how the sacrificial process can exist and function without being obliged to attribute to the ritualistic mind a manipulative ability or clairvoyance that it most certainly does not possess. I could stop there, keep going. Oh, there's 2 more paragraphs. It is entirely possible to regard the sacrificial rite as a commemoration of a real event without reducing it to the triviality of one of our own national holidays, or for that matter, without ascribing to it some neurotic compulsion, as psychoanalysts are wont to do. A trace of very real violence persists in the rite, and there is no doubt that the rite succeeds, at least partially, because of its grim associations, its lingering fascination, but its essential orientation is peaceful. Even the most violent rites are specifically designed to abolish violence. To see these rites as expressions of man's pathological morbidity is to miss the point. It goes without saying that the rite has its violent aspects, but these always involve a lesser violence, preferred as a bulwark against the far more virulent violence. Moreover, the rite aims at the most profound state of peace known to any community, the peace that follows a sacrificial crisis and results from the unanimous accord generated by the surrogate victim. To banish the evil emanations that accumulate within the community or to recapture the freshness of this original experience are one and the same task. Whether order reigns supreme or whether its reign is already challenged, the same model, the same plan of action is invariably proposed. It is the plan associated with the victorious resolution of all communal crises that involves violence against the surrogate victim.
From that perspective, it really sounds inherent, inescapable.
Mm-hmm.
Like the distinction between ritual sacrificial victim and surrogate victim. Ritual being out that solves that question of inside outside that we had established before, because surrogate Oedipus is from within. So, I mean, that might link to Jonathan's question around what is the status of guilt for ritual victim versus surrogate victim. That might be where that could be interrogated. But yeah, I get what you sort of get a sense of his interlocutors when he's writing this book, you know, the people that are pushing against the idea, and you know, like all things that are critiques of psychoanalysis, they come across as caricatures. So, like, for example, when you say, well, psychoanalysis holds an idealist conception of social conflict, right? That it emanates from the psyche or something. Well, it's like, well, like, which brand? Like, actually, that's not true, right? Like, there are some psychoanalytic accounts which ground repression within the social, right? Not within, or not solely within the psyche, right? So, you know, there's that issue, right? But yeah, it's a very helpful passage. It was really good.
I'm wondering how much sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to throw out one more thing that struck me just hearing that is the work in the book Bios, Robert Esposito sort of takes in the Agamben path and talks about how we sort of separate ourselves out as a community and sort of build ourselves up, but then we impose sort of, and we try to do that to protect life, the way that we do that is by destroying other life. And it sets up a really nice sort of paradox that sort of resembles this in some ways, where we're building up for ourselves and sort of seeing things from our, contemporary vantage point. But to do that, we have to step on the world to sort of separate ourselves. It seems like that's what we do for our society. In other words, at the edge of society, like on the borders in Mexico, we have to put kids in cages to sort of have that distinction. So he uses a really interesting, I think, sort of similar lens to produce this mimesis, which is really opposing. On one hand, it's building up. On the other hand, it's deteriorating. And he talks about that as sort of inherent in our society. I just thought I'd throw it out there if anybody's interested in it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I've thought about that too. I mean, I always read the Trumpist display of the border suffering as through the lens of like a repressed class struggle, in the sense that I've always understood what's actually at play there is that Donald Trump is a ventriloquist for the American pharmacos, right? And so there is a kind of there is a longing for retribution for their neglect and abandonment, which cannot be enacted. And Donald Trump is the compromise vehicle for the alleviation of at the minimum, the affective representational suffering that they've, right? And the class aspect is the kind of the denial of the material dimension of the reality, right? So this kind of sadistic resentment flipped out from under that becomes the primary logic of the whole operation. So then any display, not just the Mexican suffering at the border, but really actually the display of any sadism is sufficient to satisfy the infinite loss, the unfulfillable void that they experience.
Sure.
A liberal would actually take issue with my claim and say, no, it's invalid. Their suffering is actually not commensurate on any material level. It remains merely symbolic, right? It remains merely a kind of, right? So there's a whole debate there, right? But that's how I've always read that shit, because it's like, I don't know. It's so much there.
Yeah. I like the interpretation.
Anyways, yeah, this has been great, guys. Kayam, thanks for facilitating. Sorry for my
This is fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
it was a lot of fun.
What chapter will we do next? Chapter 6.
I think we need to make some progress, and I think we need to talk about Dionysus. Okay, that chapter called Dionysus, and we need to do, most importantly, the Memetic Desire and Monsters Double, which is what is that?
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. Let's really, work through Dionysius for sure, but I think chapter 6 will be our main focus next week.
Is that this time next week? Exactly the same?
Yeah, does that work for everybody? Is that okay?
Yeah, it works well for me, yeah.
Oh, good. You're in China. What time is it there now?
Well, it started at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is fine.
Okay. Cool.
Have a good rest of your morning.
Thank you. My last day in quarantine.
Oh, nice.
Well, today, then tomorrow I leave, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I have tonight as well, yeah.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
See y'all next week.
See ya.
Yeah, I'll see some of you tomorrow. We have our
Right.
first night of our working group. If you can make it, it would be great to have you all.
Was there any specific reading for that tomorrow? Because I know there's a general list, but was there anything in particular?
Hey, did you get my email? Oh no, you registered late.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is reading. Yeah, the Wendy Brown section from her latest book on the dismantlement of the social. Okay, under neoliberalism, that reading is really good. And then and then I have a huge excerpt from Lacerda on Marxism and populism, and then another excerpt from Lacerda's new book on Nietzsche. So that, and then another excerpt by Bernard Stiegler on the disaffected individual. So those are the sort of 3 readings. I need to forward. Should I forward it to you over email?
I think I got it from the Eventbrite Dropbox now too. It'll be in that Dropbox, those 3.
Absolutely. That's right.
All right, see you guys. See you guys next time.
Cool. All the best. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.